Part 3, CSS and Problems of the Web. Cascading style sheets, or CSS, provide this extra level of separation between content and presentation. What you're trying to do with CSS is to avoid controlling how you display text within the HTML itself. So the markup that's within the HTML becomes partially semantic in nature. In other words, we just use things like P for a paragraph, rather than P for a paragraph and then a font and then specifying that we want it to be 16-point bold Helvetica or whatever. And this means that it's much easier to produce really consistent documents, because in order to change what the headings look like or what the fonts look like, we do it in one place. We do it in the CSS, which can be read by every HTML page rather than having to go through and alter each page in turn. So CSS allows you to specify things like the font, the colour, bolds, italics, all those sorts of things. It allows you to define once how you want these things to appear, and then you can put all your CSS into a file and make sure that everything is consistent. The other advantage is if you want to change the look and feel of your website, you can just edit the CSS and not have to worry about changing the actual content. So let's have a look at an example of how a CSS style works. Now, this example is for H1. So this is heading level 1, and we then define how heading level 1 is going to look within curly brackets. So here we've specified a margin of 0.5 EM, 0.8 EM. I'll come back to what all these things mean in just a moment. A 1-point solid blue border, a cyan background, black text. This is the font, and then this is the padding. So what do all these weird terms mean? Well, let's start with the middle of this example. So this is a piece of text filling up this white box completely. Now, if we set the margin and the padding to 0, then that white box in the middle would be the size of this heading element. Now, by specifying padding, we can expand the size of the box containing the text. And when we specified a background colour, that would fill the whole of the box which has the text itself plus the padded area. I've only shown this in white just to make it clear that this is a different region from the padded region here. So in practice, if you actually did what's here, the whole of this region would be in cyan, not just the padding. The border, which I specified here, says what thickness, colour and pattern the line, if any, should be that surrounds the padded area. And then the margin specifies a region outside the padded box which separates it from anything else. So there's never any content in there except for what's in the background of your HTML page. It just allows you to separate the headings or the text from other bits of heading or text without adding any colour that you might use for the background of the padded box. So I've just said up here and white for clarity. This obviously is not part of the CSS information. This is just what I've done in this middle box here. So what are all these numbers and things? Well, there are different units that we can use. We can use pixels So that will be an individual pixel on the screen. Now that's not really true because web browsers allow you to do Shift Control and the plus symbol, or just Control and the minus symbol to scale pages up and down. But at the default size, then that should be 1 pixel. A point is technically 1/72nd of an inch. It's used in typesetting as the kind of smallest measure of size. So obviously we talk about things like 10-point fonts, 12-point fonts, and so on. The next unit that people use is the EM, or M, which is the point size of the font. So if we're using a 14-point font, then an M is 14 points in size. And it's approximately the width of a letter M. That's what it was originally named on the basis of. While an N is half the size of an M now, and was approximately the height of a letter N. Now you may have noticed in my example that I had different ways of specifying the numbers. In some cases I only had one number, and in some cases I had 2, and we can actually also have 4. If we only have one number, as in this first example, then that will apply to the top, the right, the bottom, and the left of the box that we're talking about. If we have 2 numbers, then the first number will apply to the top and the bottom, and the second number will apply to the right and the left. And finally, if we have 4 numbers, then those will apply to the top, right, bottom, and left in sequence. So we're starting from the top and working round clockwise. Now here's a more extensive example where I've taken something similar to what we've just seen for H1. We're also now specifying H2, H3, and paragraph. So in this case we're using a sans serif font for everything, Helvetica if available, otherwise Arial, otherwise the default sans serif. In the case of heading 1, it's going to be white text on a black background with no border but some padding and no margin either. Heading 2 will be 18-point bold Helvetica, Arial or sans serif, so it's the same size as this, but it will be just normal black on white. H3 is this time a bit smaller but italic, and this is in red, and the normal paragraph font will just be 12-point Helvetica. So if I apply those styles to that example web page that I showed you before, it ends up looking like this. You can see now we have the heading 1 in the white on black, the heading 2 being rather larger, the heading 3s being in red, and the paragraph text being in the Helvetica or sans serif font. But we didn't specify anything for the table data, so that's still in the serif font with the little kind of twisty bits on letters like T and S and Y and so on. Now you can put your CSS within the head tag. So we can say style type equals text CSS. We put our CSS in here. This is an HTML comment, by the way, so this would not be do anything if we had this comment here. And then we end the style. Or, rather better, within the head we can reference an external style sheet. So we do that with a link tag, and we say rel equals style sheet. That's telling us what this link is. And then we say the type, text/CSS, as we did before. And then we have an href, as we did with the a tag, to refer to another document. So the href is the name of the CSS file. And this indeed can be a full URL, so it can be specifying a CSS file that lives on another server. So if you want to take advantage of the fact that CSS allows you to apply exactly the same layout and styling across a whole set of web pages, this is the sort of thing that you want to do. Now, the example that you've seen already was all very well, but it only allowed you to assign a style to the element itself and therefore to every instance of the element. So, for example, we saw setting the font for a normal paragraph of text. Well, what if you wanted to be able to do something like highlight a particular paragraph of text and show that in red, for example? Well, the example here shows you how you would do that. We have our paragraph style just as we had before, and then we can create what's called a class, and in this case a class of .highlight, and we've specified that it should be of colour red. And then when we create our paragraph tag, we can say paragraph class equals highlight, and then our text, and end the paragraph. And of course that would mean if we wanted to change all our highlighted paragraphs to be green or bold or whatever, we would simply change the CSS here. Now that's all very well, but what if we didn't want to affect the whole of a paragraph? We just wanted to affect one little bit. Or perhaps we wanted to affect a whole set of paragraphs in one go. Well, there are two special tags or elements provided by HTML to work with CSS which actually do nothing other than allow you to specify a particular class. So if you think about some elements like the paragraph tag, for example, they are vertical in nature. In other words, they're splitting up things as you work down the page. While other elements or tags are horizontal in nature. So for example, the I for italics or the B for bold, they provide highlighting or markup of a range of words that's basically working across the page rather than down the page. So in the same way, div is a vertical element that does nothing, so it's similar to P for paragraph, but it does nothing by itself, and span is a horizontal element like italics and so on, but again does nothing by itself. But what these do allow you to do is to tie the element to a particular class. So in our example before, we had P font and specified the font for a paragraph, and then we had dot highlight, which specifies a class, and it was colour red. Now to highlight the whole paragraph in red, we put the class equals highlight within the paragraph tag. But if we just wanted to highlight a single word, then we could say span class equals highlight, and then the word or words, it doesn't have to be a single word, and then end the span. So this would be presented in the standard black 12-point Helvetica or Arial or sans serif as we've specified here, but this one word here would be highlighted. And the highlighting we've used at the moment is red, but you could change that to bold or a different colour or whatever. So we can use these classes in a sort of semantic way. So by that what I mean is that the class name relates to what the content is. So in the example that we saw earlier, I had this paragraph align equals right, and then I had an email address in bold, a line break, and then a link to another web page. Suppose your boss said to you, I don't want the paragraphs with the information to be aligned to the right anymore. I want it in the middle. I don't want the email address in bold. I want it to be in red. And I want to do something like colouring the links differently. Well, of course, you could go through and alter all these by hand, but of course, now we know about CSS and classes, well, we can do it with that. So this is the same thing, but using semantic markup with the classes. And for this, I've said, well, this paragraph describes the author of this web page, so I'm going to call it class equals author. And this is the email address, so I'm going to call it class equals email. I've kept this the same for the moment, but of course we could change that as well. And then I've defined the author class as being text align right, and the email class as being font weight bold. And so that does exactly the same as what we had previously, but it has separated the detail of the presentation from the content of the web page. As a result of this, CSS is deprecating many HTML tags and attributes. So things like the font tag, the align attribute, and the color attribute are strongly discouraged, and instead you should do that all in CSS. So for the last few minutes, I'm going to talk about some of the problems of the web and some of the ideas that had been developed for the web but really haven't kind of really seen much traction. So one of the problems of the web, as I've described it, is that web pages with attractive layout and tables can produce powerful visual images which are easy for you to digest when you're reading them, but they're not easy for computers to find anything out from automatically. So trying to extract data from HTML visual markup results in information loss. And of course, if the layout changes, if you've tried to extract data from a web page with some sort of parser that you've written, then the page will break. So you can envisage any web page really as being a process that happens like this. We have data. Now those data may be in a database, they may be in your brain, and what we do then is extract some subset of those data and display them on a web page. Now, as a consumer of that information, you as a person can look at that page, extract the data quite reliably. But for a computer, that can be difficult. So when we extract data in the first place from our database or from our brain, some of the semantics are likely to be lost and instead replaced by visual markup. So in extracting the data from that visual markup, your brain might be able to do it, but a computer is likely to make mistakes. And that leads us to partial and error-prone data. Back in the early 2000s, the idea of the semantic web was introduced. And this was designed to address these problems. The idea then was that we had fully semantic markup. The web itself would become a huge database, and software tools known as software agents could be used to retrieve relevant results. Now this idea was also put forward by Sir Tim Berners-Lee, and it's described very nicely in a Scientific American article from 2001. The idea then was that all data would be stored and sent in XML together with a style sheet to be able to display those data. That would be responsible for the formatting and display. And the key difference from the normal web was the use of XML rather than HTML, supported by ontologies, in other words, kind of structured dictionaries of what these words mean, what the semantics of the tags are. And then the data would be presented by direct display of the XML using the extensible style sheet language, or by translation to HTML using XSLT, followed by formatting with CSS. So this kind of takes us through those sorts of options. If we have some set of data, perhaps in a relational database or in your brain or in an XML database, what happens with the normal web is that gets converted into HTML. It goes over HTTP to a web browser. That was the envisaged first generation. Now, in the second generation, the data would go to XML. That would go over HTTP to XSLT-enabled web browsers, or through an XSL-enabled web browser and Java applet, or through a system called SOAP to other sorts of applications. Now, I'm not really going to talk about SOAP at all at the moment, but we will talk about it briefly in a later lecture. Then the other ideas were that XML itself could go to future browsers and applications, could go to these kind of robots and agents that were able to search the web and pull together information, and using other technologies such as RDF and UDDI to achieve that. Now, while all this seems a great idea, it really never took off. And instead what has happened is the development of web services. And again, we will talk about that in more detail when we talk about SOAP in a later lecture. So all of these things over on the right really have never taken off in a big way. And we're still a fair way away from this, because instead this web services idea has been popular, and most of the web pages are still done this way through HTML. But instead we've had a big explosion in client-side computing with JavaScript, and sometimes sending data in XML or another simple format known as JSON, and then JavaScript running on your web browser doing something with those data. So just to summarize then, we talked about HTML and XML as markup languages. We mentioned something of the problems of visual markup and those ideas of second and third generation web, which, as I've said, really has now been replaced by web services, and these allow us to overcome the problems of visual markup. However, also the separation of content and presentation by use of classes which are semantically named, things like author and email in my example, and then using the CSS to format what those classes look like, that separation allows you to parse those HTML files relatively successfully. So I also at the end mentioned the idea of the semantic web and explained how it's really never taken off, and that web services are the way that people tend to go. And as I said, we will talk about that in one of the last lectures.